The heat came off the boards like a forge as the crowd pressed tight around the auction block, their boots grinding grit into the planks where the orphan girl stood barefoot, with her wrists bound in frayed rope, the sun cutting her small shadow sharp against the dust, and the jeers raked her ears raw, too scrawny for work, too ugly for a wife, while the auctioneer grinned under a hat slick with sweat, his voice rolling oily as creek mud as he hollered that this little scrap of bones could still fetch a price for anyone needing hands to scrub or a throat to sing. And men laughed, one tossing a nickel in the dirt just to watch her flinch. And she did, chin dropping until her tangled hair curtained her face, and still the auctioneer's patter flowed like a preacher's curse, promising they'd start the bid not in coin, but in trade. Boots, whiskey, bullets, saddles. Anything a man would part with for a piece of property that once had a name. And the girl's stomach knotted tight because she knew what came next. Knew it from the whispers in the orphan car, from the pitying glances when the matron signed her away, and her knees shook under the weight of eyes that saw nothing but something to own. And then a voice slithered through the din, low and slick as oil on iron. The sheriff leaning lazy against a hitch post with his badge winking like a joke in the glare, saying he'd toss a saddle on the table if no one else had the sand to start. And laughter cracked the air as men slapped thighs and called it fair, hide for hide, flesh for leather, and the girl's throat locked around a cry she wouldn't give them. Not now, not ever. And the hammer lifted in the auctioneer's fist, ready to fall like a gavel sealing a fate. When the silence split down the spine of the crowd, not with a shout, but with a shadow moving slow, parting men like smoke in wind, and the drifter came through, long and lean in a coat worn pale as bone, his hat brim slashed low over eyes that burned flat and hard, and his boots ate the dust in soundless strides until he stood at the edge of the block with nothing in his hands but the weight of a gaze that pinned the sheriff like a nail. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet as a wolf's breath, yet it carried clean across the yard, each word striking like a hammer on iron. "I'll bid!" And the auctioneer barked a laugh till the drifter said the rest. "I bid my life." And the hush that fell was a thing you could taste, bitter as blood and twice as sharp. And the sheriff's grin curdled slow because every man there knew what that meant. No gold, no saddle, no trade but bone for bone. Breath for breath. And in that moment the girl's heart stumbled like a spooked colt because for the first time in forever, someone was standing between her and the dark. Someone whose voice didn't sneer or sell, but sounded like a door slamming shut on hell. And when the drifter climbed the first step and laid his colt on the block like scripture, the world shifted with a creak that wasn't timber. It was fate bending, ready to break. The silence cracked under a slow laugh that crawled like a snake through the crowd. The sheriff peeling off the hitch post with his badge flashing mean in the sun, his hand riding the swell of his hip where a revolver slept easy, and his boots whispered menace as he stalked through the dust, tipping his hat back so the girl could see the grin that didn't touch his eyes cold as water under ice. And he told the drifter soft enough to sting that a man's life ain't worth spit without a name to tie the rope to. So maybe he'd speak as out loud for the record, unless the record's burned with the jailhouse he left in flames. And the murmur rippled sharp through the watchers, heads cocking like buzzards when the sheriff spat that word. Wanted, and the bride. That never was of this tale flinched, though she wasn't here because truth hung heavy on the air like iron chains. But the drifter didn't blink, didn't twitch, just stood with his jaw set hard as bedrock and his shadow running long over the boards where the girl trembled like a colt, and his voice rolled low, flat as a hammer on cold steel, saying names die when men earn better ones, and he'd earn this one now. But the sheriff grinned wider, teeth bright against the dusk of his stubble, and snapped his fingers so two deputies slunk forward, rifles loose in their paws, and he purred. That bidding's a fine game till the stakes draw blood, So if the drifter's set to wager his hide, then let's make the pot fit the prize. And with that, he hauled the girl's chin up, jerking her face to the crowd like a trophy, snarling that the trade don't close till she's branded property, and the man who claims her burns for it, too. And the words slithered through the heat like fire snakes, making the onlookers hiss and mutter because cruelty sells dear under a noon sun, and the drifter's fingers twitched once where they hung loose by his sides before curling calm again. His gaze locked on the sheriff's smirk, and he said through his teeth that the girl walks free or somebody leaves here riding 6 nails to glory. And the sheriff's laugh boomed wide enough to rattle the porch boards as he barked for the block to clear, his voice slicing the yard like a cleaver as he roared for the bell, because this auction just turned to blood sport, and hell was about to gavel down hard. And as the girl's eyes went wide enough to drink the whole sky, a shadow rippled across the dust where a hawk wheeled slow and mean above the gallows pole, its cry slicing through the sunlit silence like a prophecy written in talons and fire. The crowd packed in tight, boots grinding dust into the cracks of the boards as the sheriff's voice cracked like a whip over the roar of hoots and jeers, barking that this bid would be written in blood, not brass, and every man there leaned closer because cruelty makes men hungry, their eyes bright with a hunger older than law, and the orphan girl stood frozen at the block's far edge with her rope-bitten wrists clutched against her chest, her breath a ghost in the heat as the deputies dragged the auction planks clear to make a pit in the yard, tossing down a chain like a serpent's spine. And the sheriff grinned wide as a skull as he called for the bell, and when it clanged through the noon glare, it sounded like doom tolling from a gallows pole. And the drifter moved then, slow as tar sliding on iron, stripping his coat and laying it across the block with his colt resting quiet on top. The sun glancing fire off the steel as if the weapon grinned too, and his shirt clung dark at the shoulder where an old scar rode like a pale snake across his flesh, and the sheriff sneered that scars don't win fights, only grit and guns. And the drifter said nothing, only stepped into the ring of boards like a man walking into church with death for a preacher. And the first challenger swaggered forward, a slab of beef with a grin carved deep, and a bowie glinting like a fang, and the crowd bayed loud as wolves as the sheriff spat for blood, and the drifter just watched, his eyes flat as hammered lead, his hands loose at his sides, until the man lunged, knife singing, and then time broke, the world snapping white as the drifter's arm struck like a striking hawk, his fist crushing bone, the knife spinning in a red arc. And the roar that followed drowned the wind as the man hit the dust, choking on his own teeth. But before the echo died, the next wolf came grinning through the smoke of powder as a rifle cracked from the porch, the ball hissing past the drifter's ear, grazing it with a kiss that burned like fire. And the sheriff laughed like a crow on carrion, hollering that the rules just changed. Last man standing takes the prize, and hell help the fool who calls foul, and rifles lifted like iron thorns around the pit, men closing like a tide of black water, and the drifter bent slow, scooping the bowie from the blood as his breath sawed through teeth, and his voice rolled out low, a sound like stone breaking in a dry riverbed, telling the girl not to move no matter what she heard, because this wasn't over till the devil himself climbed the block and begged for mercy. And her chin lifted through tears at that, her small jaw locking like a hatch on a powder keg, and up above the hawk screamed once, high and harsh against the white blaze of the sky, its shadow sliding like a blade across the sheriff's grin, and in that sliver of silence the drifter smiled without warmth. A wolf's smile, and the fight boiled loose like a dam busting red. The smell hit first, sweet and foul, like sin burning in the sun. Then the roar of flame as orange leapt from the barn roof, sparks whipping into the noon glare like angry hornets, and the crowd scattered screaming as the sheriff's men drove torches into hay with whoops that ripped the sky, their laughter knifing through the crackle while horses shrieked behind the smoke, and the orphan girl flinched hard on the block as heat licked the wind, her eyes wide and wet until the drifter's voice rolled out low and iron, telling her to look at him. Not the fire, because hell was for cowards, and she was standing in daylight, and his tone poured steel into her bones, though her knees trembled like saplings. And then the sheriff strode out through the smoke, his badge winking like a serpent's eye, a rifle loose in his grip, and a grin carved deep as canyon shadow. Saying this auction just sweetened because now the prize smells like smoke, and any man can claim her if he kills quick enough. And from the blur behind him stepped a brute, wrapped in a black slicker, shoulders broad as doors, and the drifter's jaw tightened because he knew that shape like a scar in his blood. The man who'd slit his brother's throat on a back trail 10 winters gone. And the world tilted on its iron hinge as their eyes locked through the heat shimmer, 2 wolves smelling the same kill, and the slicker grinned slow, showing teeth yellow as old ivory, and drawled that biddings for lambs. He came to collect in blood, and his knife flashed like lightning in a coffin sky, and the drifter said nothing, only eased the bowie up, the blade black with another man's sins, and the girl whimpered soft as the sheriff barked for them to make it a show worth dying for. His voice whipping through the roar of flame while the fire spat embers that drifted like devils across the yard. And then the slicker lunged, steel whistling, and the drifter bent sideways, his fist a hammer cracking ribs as the knife carved air and kissed his coat sleeve, spilling a hot thread down his arm, and pain flared white, but his boots held, grinding deep as they grappled in a blur of muscle and smoke. Grunts shredded into the roar of fire, while the girl's cry pierced like a hawk's scream above the din, and the crowd surged like a river gone rabid, men shoving, boots stomping, fists pounding rails till splinters flew, and then the drifter wrenched loose, slamming the bowie's hilt into the slicker's skull so hard the crack rang like a church bell, and the man sagged but didn't fall, his laughter bubbling red as he hissed that he'd see Jonah in hell before sundown. And the name punched the air like a bullet. Jonah, the ghost they'd hunted through dust and lawless years. And the sheriff's grin widened sharp as a saw as he snapped his fingers for the next wave, 5 men fanning rifles like iron teeth, while the barn belched fire into a sky gone black with smoke, and the drifter wiped blood from his brow with a hand steady as stone, then laid the bowie across his palm and whispered to the girl, words the wind nearly stole. Don't move, don't blink, and don't pray, because God just left this yard, and it's only us and lead now. The yard went savage when the first rifle cracked, and splinters flew like hornets, men screaming as powder smoke rolled off the porch in choking clouds, and through the blaze of the burning barn, a wild bay horse exploded, eyes white as bone and mane flinging sparks like a comet, ripping the hitch free and hammering into the mob so hard bodies flew like broken dolls, their curses swallowed by the thunder of hooves. And in that chaos the drifter moved, not like a man but like a blade cutting through water, snatching the orphan from the block with a grip that felt like iron tempered in fire, tucking her small ribs tight under his arm as bullets hissed past like hornets tasting blood. And the sheriff's roar split the smoke, his badge glinting hell-red as he bellowed for the men to drop the ghost where he stood, but the ghost was already moving. Boots pounding through the churn of dust and embers toward the half-fallen corral, his shoulder a furnace of pain where lead had grazed deep, and his breath a rasp that scraped his ribs raw, and the girl clung silent, her tiny fingers digging into his shirt like claws while her heartbeat jackhammered against his chest. And then the slicker lunged from the haze like some devil dredged from the pit, his blade catching firelight as he slashed for the girl's hair, and the drifter twisted hard, his elbow shattering the outlaw's jaw in a crunch that spat teeth into the flame-lit dark. But the sheriff's shot cracked next, screaming off the stone and tearing a groove along the drifter's temple, spinning him half blind as the world flared white, and he staggered but didn't break, because hell itself would freeze before he dropped the child, and then the hawk screamed high above, its shadow slicing the smoke like a black scythe, and that sound hauled him back from the brink like a rope from heaven, and he hurled himself toward the corral gate as the bay crashed through the rails in a hail of splinters, rearing high with eyes gone wild as the drifter swung the girl up and vaulted behind her in one savage motion, boots skimming sparks as the horse bunched and launched into the gale, iron shoes striking fire from stone, and the wind tore their faces as bullets howled past. The sheriff's curses shredding in the dark behind them while the flames clawed higher, licking the night like a red tide, and the drifter bent low over the saddle, blood running hot down his jaw as he whispered into the girl's hair, words she'd never forget as long as breath burned her chest. "Hold fast, little bird. The storm ain't done yet," and the hawk wheeled above, crying fierce enough to shake the bones of the earth as they vanished into the smoke where the canyon opened its jaws to swallow them whole. The moon cut a thin blade across the canyon rim as the bay tore down the stone throat, its hooves striking sparks off rock slick with ice, and the drifter bent low, blood dripping hot into the wind as the orphan clung like a shadow against his chest, her breath small and fast against the roar in his ears, and behind them came the hammer of hooves and the hell howl of men, rifles spitting fire into the black like wolves snapping bone, and each shot hissed past close enough to flay skin, ricochets sparking sharp off the canyon walls where the shadows folded deep. And he knew this gorge was a coffin waiting for nails because the pass ran narrow as a blade's edge, a place where a man could bleed out and freeze before his curse hit the sky. But there was no turning now, only forward where the switchback curled like a rattler through the stone, and the hawk screamed above. Its cry shredding the night clean as lightning, and the sound burned a promise into his skull. Live or kill, nothing between, and the horse lunged hard, ribs heaving fire, when the canyon mouth split wide and torchlight flared ahead, a wall of riders blocking the choke point with guns glinting like a row of teeth, and the sheriff's laugh boomed like a church bell gone rotten as he rode out front, badge winking hell red in the glow, and his voice rolled oily as creek mud, telling Jonah, because now the name was a bullet in the wind, that the auction's over and the lawless are done hiding, and if Jonah thought the fire was hot, wait till he tasted iron. And in that breath, the drifter saw it, saw the whole snare snap shut, the men boxing them from both ends like wolves driving elk to the cut, and his jaw locked hard as bedrock as he swung the bay sideways. Boots digging deep while the girl whimpered mama into his chest, a word that tore him raw in places no bullet could reach, and his eyes raked the canyon rim where shadows stitched black against the stars. And there like a ghost out of smoke, crouched a figure with a rifle long as truth, its barrel leveled dead at his heart, and the face behind it burned like a scar branded on memory. A face he'd once called brother before blood turned bad and law turned loose, and for a breath the canyon dropped into silence so thick he could hear his own pulse hammer like war drums. And then the shot split the dark, white fire ripping past his jaw to shatter stone inches from the girl's hair, and her cry pierced the roar as the hawk stooped low, its wings cutting sparks from torchlight, and Jonah flung the bay into a dead run, bullets screaming, shale flying, his voice raw in her ear. "Hold tight, little bird, hold till the stars fall," and the canyon closed around them like a mouth of knives. The switchback coiled like a serpent up the spine of the canyon, the night boiling with torchlight and gun smoke as Jonah slid from the saddle, boots grinding shale that hissed down into the dark, his breath slicing the cold while the orphan clung to the rock lip where he'd left her crouched, whispering she'd wait. But her eyes burned like tiny coals, and he moved low, a shadow among stone. The bowie gripped reverse in his fist, and his Colt cold against his thigh, and above him the posse crawled slow, rifles angled like iron fangs, their laughter rolling down the gorge like a hymn for the damned, and Jonah's pulse thudded steady, counting steps, counting breaths, and when the first boot creaked close enough to taste the dust off its sole. He struck, the blade flashing silent in the smoke as he drove steel up under a rib and clamped a hand over the man's mouth. Feeling the hot gush against his palm as he eased the corpse down, slow, then rolled for cover as a torch flared near, voices barking sharp, and the night exploded in lead as Jonah's Colt barked fire, muzzle flashes strobing his jaw hard and pale as granite, each shot snapping a man backward into the black, their screams tumbling down the gorge like stones, and the girl clapped both hands to her ears, teeth biting blood into her lip as the sky ripped open with thunder. But Jonah never stopped, his body moving like rage-given bones, his blood slicking his sleeve, stinging his eye where the grays burned raw, and then a voice slashed the din, a voice he knew like the taste of iron, calling his name low and cruel as a snake's hiss, and he turned to see him step from the smoke, the slicker gone so the scar burned clear in the torch glow. A grin splitting his face as he lifted a long iron that winked red with flame, and the outlaw's laugh crawled over the rocks like poison, saying, 10 years is a long ride, Jonah, long enough to bury law and breed wolves. And he cocked the hammer slow so the click cracked like a coffin nail, and Jonah felt the years bleed back, felt the weight of a brother's blood under his boots, and a vow carved deep in the marrow, and the world shrank to that grin, that gun, that name hissing like a curse between teeth, and then the hawk screamed high, slicing the black with wings of firelight, and Jonah moved as the shot split the dark, rolling hard, the slug singing past his ear as his Colt bucked twice, sparks kicking from stone as the outlaw melted into smoke, laughing like a church burning, and the silence after was thick as tar, broken only by the girl's cry and the whisper of boots slipping closer through the ash-streaked dark. And Jonah knew this wasn't the reckoning yet. It was only the cut before the kill. The wind clawed knives along the canyon rim as Jonah dragged breath through teeth gritted like iron, boots grinding shale slick with blood and frost, his Colt heavy as judgment in his fist, and his ribs screaming fire from the slug that scored bone. But none of that bit as deep as the sound. Small, strangled, a cry that wasn't the wind. And when he rounded the fang of rock, his gut iced harder than the stone. Because there, under the red spit of torchlight, the outlaw stood grinning wide, one arm clamped like a shackle around the orphan's thin shoulders, her face white as bone and streaked with soot, eyes huge and black as the void yawning beyond the rim, and his other hand curled lazy around a long iron, its barrel kissing the hollow of her throat like a lover's whisper. And the world knotted down to that sight, that smirk. That girl's breath fogging in quick little ghosts as the outlaw's laugh crawled over the gale, low and slick, telling Jonah the auction's over but the wager's still good. His life for hers, only now the bid comes with teeth, because one twitch and her blood writes his name on this snow forever, and Jonah's pulse slammed hard enough to crack stone as the outlaw hauled her to the lip where the black gorge opened like hell's own grin, and the sheriff's dogs howled behind, boots pounding closer, rifles winking fire in the smoke. But Jonah never turned, never blinked, just stepped slow into the spit of light, his voice rolling out flat and cold as a coffin nail, saying if the bastard wanted him, come take him, but the girl walks free, and the outlaw's grin sharpened like a saw as he snarled, that freedom's for men who ain't ghosts. And Jonah's breath sawed through ribs as the weight of 10 winters ground on his spine, the vow he swore on a grave, the blood he left smoking on a trail. And he knew this wasn't just a fight. It was the last ledger, written in flesh, signed in lead, and the hawk screamed high, stooping low so its shadow sliced the fireglow like a blade from heaven. And in that cut of silence, Jonah moved, every muscle firing like a powder train, his colt leaping up as the outlaw jerked the girl sideways with a roar, steel flaring in a blur that tore sparks off the rock, and the first shot cracked white fire, ripping the dark open like dawn's fist, and the girl's scream split the night as boots pounded closer and torches spat sparks into the black. And Jonah threw himself into the teeth of hell, knowing this would not end with dawn. It would end with blood-soaking snow at the edge of the world. The rim was a black knife edge slashed against a sky ripped raw by fire and wind, the gorge yawning below like a mouth hungry for bones. And Jonah staggered into the red spit of torchlight with blood boiling hot down his sleeve, his breath tearing out in white ghosts, as the outlaw's laughter crawled across the stone, low and jagged, a sound that made the dark crawl tighter. And then he stepped from the smoke with the girl still clamped in his fist, her small face ash-pale and streaked with tears, her sob strangled in the iron crook of his arm, while his other hand dragged a colt black as sin, and the sheriff's pack fanned behind him like wolves drunk on blood, their rifles winking like eyes. And Jonah felt the night knot down to a single rope strung over hell. One pull wrong and it snapped, and all three dropped into the black. But his voice came flat, cold as coffin iron, when he told the outlaw this was his last ride, that blood buys nothing but ghosts, and the slicker grinned wide as a saw as he spat, that ghosts were all Jonah ever had, that the girl was just a marker on a debt 10 winters deep. And then his thumb jerked back the hammer slow so the click cracked like a gallows bell, and the world blew wide in a roar of lead, Jonah diving sideways in a blaze of white fire, the slug whining past his ribs as his own colt barked flame, sparks strobing the night as the girl wrenched free with a scream, raw enough to slice bone, and Jonah saw her tumble across shale just as the outlaw slammed into him like a rock slide, their bodies crashing to the rim in a whirl of fists and steel, boots skidding on grit. And then the bowie sang free, flashing red in the fire glow as the outlaw drove it for Jonah's throat. But Jonah caught his wrist. Their breath snarling hot against each other's faces, and the blade hovered a breath from skin, while his muscles locked like iron bands, his ribs screaming fire as the outlaw hissed his name like a curse, swearing he'd carve it into his own heart before he let Jonah breathe. And Jonah spat blood in his eye and slammed his skull forward, bone cracking like timber in frost, the knife skittering off into the dark where it clanged and was gone. And then the outlaw's roar split the wind as he raked for Jonah's gun. But Jonah drove a fist deep into his gut, his arm a steel piston, and ripped the colt up from the grit, jamming the barrel under his chin. Their shadows tangled against the fire-slashed sky, and Jonah's voice came like the last nail in a coffin. "Tell hell I sent you," and the shot cracked the night like thunder splitting mountains. The outlaw arching once before the void swallowed him whole, his scream tearing down the gorge as the hawk stooped low with a cry fierce enough to shake the bones of the earth, and silence followed like a shroud, broken only by the hiss of snow on the blood-streaked stone, and the small sob that crawled from the dark, where the girl knelt shaking under the shadow of a dying torch. The storm broke slow, bleeding pale gold across the ragged rim as dawn clawed its way over the black teeth of stone, painting the blood-streaked snow in bruised colors of fire and frost. And Jonah stood where the night had burned itself out, his boots planted in grit soaked dark, his coat flayed open and stiff with blood that wasn't all his, and his breath sawed hard through ribs that felt carved from iron and pain. But his hands were steady as he lowered the colt, its barrel smoking soft in the cold like the last whisper of hell. And behind him, the canyon yawned wide and silent, swallowing the outlaw's scream into a bottomless throat where no name mattered anymore, only the echo of violence dying under the hawk's cry as it wheeled high above, its wings flashing molten in the newborn sun, a fierce and lonely crown against the white. And Jonah turned then, slow as a man dragging chains from his soul, his boots crunching frost toward the scrap of life crouched in the shadow of a split boulder. The orphan girl folded small as a prayer, her face streaked black with soot and salt, her eyes too big for her bones as they lifted to him, and for a breath he saw his own ghosts in their depths. The boy he couldn't save, the blood he couldn't wash from his hands. And it hit like a bullet under the ribs. But he crouched low, his voice rough as a file when he told her soft it was over. No one's touch would ever chain her again, and her thin arms locked around his neck like roots clinging to rock. And he felt the quake of her sobs hammer through his chest, till something broke loose in the hollows where grief had camped like winter, and he let it fall quiet. No sound but the rasp of wind, and the hawk's cry slicing the clean sky. And when she stilled, her cheek warm against his collar, he rose slow, boots dragging shadows long over the snow, and the sheriff's badge lay half buried near the fire's ash, dulled and twisted like a lie cooked too long, and Jonah ground it into the grit with his heel till metal screamed, then turned his back on every name the law had ever called him, on every scar it branded into his blood. And he walked for the light creeping up the far rim, the girl's fingers tangled in his coat like a vow that would never break. And the hawk rode the wind ahead, its wings cutting a bright arc over the scarred earth like a blade forging a road where none had been. And Jonah followed with the fire still in his chest, a slow and savage promise that this life, the one he'd bid at the block for the price of his breath, was no longer his alone, but theirs, hammered in lead, sealed in blood, and carried forward into the raw gold of dawn where no chain, no badge, no devil in a black slicker could ever reach them again,